Hello everyone, welcome in Paris. My name is Romain and today I'm gonna be your guide. We're gonna stroll through the main highlights of Paris, through the Latin Quarter, through the island of the city, have a glimpse to Notre Dame and then end up our tour around the Louvre. Are you ready? Then we go! We begin our tour on Place Saint-Michel on the banks of the Seine on the edge of the Latin Quarter and Saint-Germain. We will head immediately into the Latin Quarter, the sector most associated with Roman Paris, to explore its narrow ancient streets and to visit the remains of a Roman bathhouse. Next, we will take a walk inside the medieval Church of Saint-Severin, one of Paris' most overlooked treasures. We will then get a taste of the 1920s literary Paris with a stop at Shakespeare and Company bookshop, once the haunt of literary greats such as Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, and Ernest Hemingway. Leaving the Latin Quarter behind, we will cross the Seine to the Ile de la Cite for a quick visit to arguably Paris' most treasured landmark, Notre Dame. Finally, we will explore the northern part of the island, including a former palace used by French kings, and end of the Pont Neuf, Paris' oldest bridge. There is a lot to see, so let's get started. So ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our walk on one of the main and most famous squares of Paris. This square is called the Saint Michael Square. As you can see right now, I am looking at the north, and what you see here is the island of the city. We are just at the edge, at the shore of the river of the Seine. This big square that was built in the 1850s is the edge between two of the most beautiful districts of Paris. First here, to the west, you can see the gorgeous Saint-Germain. You can consider Saint-Germain as the capital of letters, philosophy, and maybe one of the snobbiest districts of Paris. But we are heading to the east, to the Latin Quarter, which is far older and takes its roots straight back to the Roman Empire. But before we go, maybe we should say a little word about this fountain, the Saint Michael Fountain. The Saint Michael Fountain was built at the same time as this square in the 1850s. It was built by Napoleon III. Napoleon III is the one that ruled France basically all around the 1850s, 60s until 1871. You see here has a statue, Saint Michael, which is like beating down the devil. But it was not supposed to be Saint Michael originally. Indeed, originally, it was supposed to be Napoleon III, being right here in the middle of the fountain. The problem is that Napoleon III, because he came to the power with a coup, was not that popular among the Parisians. So, in order to avoid riotings in the city, and you know that rioting is basically the national sport in France, he decided to switch this statue for Saint Michael himself, beating down the devil. As the style of architecture, we call that basically Napoleon III style. There is another main famous building in Paris which is basically built the same. It's the famous Opéra Garnier. However, you can see that there are some writings down those two dragon lion statues. Those ones are far more recent because they are here in remembrance of the French that got killed here during the fights of the liberation of Paris in August 1944. This is indeed around here that most of the fights, here that the uprising of the resistance against the German occupation was the harshest. All right, so we're now moving slightly to get out of the the Saint Michael Square, and we're heading to the Latin Quarter. So just so you can know, this enormous building being in reconstruction, this is an enormous sorrow for us Parisians. Indeed, right here used to be, until just a few weeks ago, one of the most famous bookshops of Paris. All the students of Paris, all the students of La Sorbonne for generations used to buy their books here, but it got closed. Closed because the owner of the building simply thought that it was not bringing enough money to have a bookshop. So he basically sold the walls to another company. To me, in my opinion, this is an enormous waste. Maybe a few words about this metro station. It is quite characteristic. Wandering in Paris, you're gonna see thousands of those metro stations. Look at how it is designed. Isn't that strange? You see that on the contrary of the rest of Paris, which is made of straight lines, this one is like organic, like it's made with bones, very natural. This is because this is called Art Nouveau, literally new art. New art was created in 1900 as a reaction to Paris being made of geometrical lines and a reaction to Paris, to the society basically, being heavily industrialized, all right? So Art Nouveau, it's quite typical of the Paris of this time. So now we are slowly leaving, you see, the Saint Michel Square, and we're going inside the Latin Quarter. The Latin Quarter is, I think, one of the districts of Paris that has the most charm. What do you think is the origin of this name, Latin Quarter? So some people would think this is because the Romans used to live here. Well, basically the Romans indeed used to live here, but this is not the reason why the Latin Quarter has its name. No, the reason is another origin. Back in the medieval times, the Latin Quarter was famous for being the district of the universities. Yes? So you have to imagine the Latin Quarter has a labyrinth of very small streets full of schools that used to be called college. Of course, it has nothing to see with the modern definition of college. And all those colleges used together to be the university with a capital U. And the common language all those European students had in common was Latin. And anyway, the language of knowledge back in the medieval times was Latin. So basically, this is the reason why we call this place the Latin Quarter, because this is the place where people used to speak Latin. What is super fascinating with this district is that the streets are extremely old. For example, the street we're like strolling around, called Rue de la Harpe, is one of the oldest of Paris. This one might be around the 1200s. Before it was renovated, mostly in the 1800s, we're going to talk about that, the street was divided in several pieces. For example, the one we just wandered around was called La Rue de la Juiverie. Of course, you would never use such a word today because Juiverie means, let's say, literally Jewishness. Today it would be seen as an anti-Semitic word, but back then it would simply mean that most of the Jewish schools used to be around. So you see, one of the simple ways to spot that you are in a very old street in Paris is to look at the style of the building. Look at this. You can see here that there are no common style. There is no unit of style in the building. All the buildings are built a different way. The windows are not at the same level. They're not at the same height. They're not even with the same roof. This is basically because you see here layers and layers of history one upon each other's. There can be centuries between all of those buildings. So most of the times when you see that, you can be sure that you're facing buildings that were not renovated in the 1800s. Among one of those buildings, there is one I really want to show you. So follow me. Look at this. It's hidden here and most of the tourists miss it, but look at this. You see? A huge door, enormous enough to have a horse carriage going through, and above the door, a face made of stone. We call this kind of face mascaron. Not macaron, don't make the confusion, but mascaron. The mascarons were designed in order to be at the entrance of what we call in French un hôtel particulier, a private mansion. So yes, what you see here, this old building, back in a time was an hôtel particulier, a private mansion. It would be owned by one only family. And those faces that we call the mascarons, they had one main goal: to show off. Yes, indeed, according to the taste of those faces, with the materials that could be used, could be gold, could be leather, could be stone, the families living inside would then express their good taste, even sometimes their political opinions. So every time you wander in Paris, always keep your nose up to find those mascarons. Most of the time, when you see a mascaron above a door like this, you can be pretty sure that you're facing a former private mansion. Sometimes some of those mascarons can be far more modern. For example, this one is very more modern than the other one we saw. The other one we saw was from the 1800s, when this one is clearly from the beginning of the 2000s. All right, so this one is far more recent. So we're heading now to the south, and we're heading to one of the oldest remainings of all Paris. Just one thing I really want you to notice. I don't know if you see that around, but the streets are extremely calm, almost empty. This is absolutely unusual. What you see here are the pure consequences of the COVID. All right. Usually, this district is maybe one of the most active, like crawling with people and visitors. So you see, we've been wandering in very small and narrow streets, and we're going to see even smaller ones. And yet, look at these boulevards right now. You see? Very long, very straight, very wide. Remember that I quickly mentioned that Paris was renovated in the 1800s. Well, this is exactly what you see here. Up, I'm going to try to cross without being killed. Yes, indeed, because Paris was the smell of small and narrow streets, it was decided then that it had to be renovated. It happened during the reign of Napoleon III. You know, Napoleon III, and the architect in charge of this renovation was Mr. Haussmann. So the reason why he would design the boulevard this way is quite simple. First, that would help about the transportation, about the traffic. You have no idea of the size of the traffic jams before Paris was renovated. The second reason is to make it cleaner and to have enough space to use electric lights. Hop, pardon monsieur. Excusez-moi. But one of the main reasons, of course, was to make the city easier to control. We're going to talk about that later. You're going to understand. But what I want you to see right now is this. Look at this building. You're maybe facing one of the oldest buildings of Paris. I'm going to try to get it a little bit closer. So you see, it's very different from the rest of Paris. Instead of being made of big, huge limestones and with pointed arches, as you're going to see everywhere in Paris, this one is made of round arches and of small bricks. Who do you think built this? I'm sure you can guess. Indeed, those are the Romans. What I just been showing to you was the Roman bath, the remaining of the Roman bath. I'm going to try to get a little bit closer. So you see, look around. Basically, the best season to come in Paris is spring. All the parks are greens, all the trees are enormous. Look at that. I feel like I'm not in a city anymore. I feel like I'm inside like a forest. So, bonjour monsieur. Look at that. So you see, so this is the rest of the bath complex from the Roman times. So back then, Paris was not even called Paris. Paris would have been called Lutetia, Lutes, okay, which basically means the city of mud, and that gives you a slight idea of the consideration the first Romans had when they arrived here with Julius Caesar, like a few years before Jesus Christ. But on the 3rd century, Lutes became a quite important city. The emperor even had one of his own residences in Paris, and the enormous size of this bath complex, of this public bath, gives you an idea of the importance of the city. Basically, if you would be inside the baths, the vault would have been 27 meters above your heads, okay? So it's absolutely enormous. The reason why it was maintained until today is simply because the Parisians, through centuries, kept reusing and reusing and reusing it. And today, the Cluny Museum, that's its name, reused the Roman bath walls to welcome one of the most beautiful and most impressive museums about the medieval times. This is a museum specialized in the Middle Ages, all right? Okay, now we're turning on our back and we're going back to the heart of the Latin Quarter. I'm just gonna cut off just the time for me to go back and to cross the road. See you in exactly 5 seconds. Hi everyone, I am back and the sun is back as well. So you see, at the end of the street is the Cluny Museum, like the Roman bath that just come from. And I'm about to go back, as I told you, to the heart of the Latin Quarter. Just before we head a little bit further, I'd like to show you a very particular building that I love very much. See? Mostly in Paris, all the roofs are flat, okay? All the roofs are flat, they're designed the same way. But sometimes when you are in very old district that remained preserved from the Haussmann renovations, you can see those pointy roof like this. We call that pignon. And those, most of them are pretty rare. This one is from the 1600s. Now, there is a street I'd like to show you. Remember, I mentioned that the Latin Quarter got his name from his student past, from the fact that most of the students used to study here and live here. Well, look at this street. And, more interesting, look at its name. Rue de la Parcheminerie. Parcheminerie. It means the street of the parchemine shops. You might have heard of parchemine, I guess. This is the paper made of mostly animal skins, could be sheep, could be veal, that people used to write on during the medieval times. So this street was very simply, like 5-6 centuries ago, the street where most of the students used to buy their papers, used to buy their parchemine. You see, it's a very old street because you can see that the walls are not even straight. And there is one detail I really love, which is again a very beautiful private mansion, a very beautiful hôtel particulier from the 18th century. We know that Diderot, one of the most famous French philosophers on the Enlightenment, used to live here for a short while, and you can see just above the doors an interesting detail. I don't know if you can see those carvings, but they represent what you would maybe call in English a scallop, like a seashell, but in French we call it Saint Jacques. The Saint Jacques in France, in Europe, they were mostly used for the pilgrims to wear on their clothes during their pilgrimage to Saint-Jacques de Compostelle, San Diego de Compostela, one of the main pilgrimage city in Spain. All right, so keep this information in mind. It's going to play an important role during the rest of our visit. As well, you can see this very, very old and very famous bookshops. Of course, we're going to see a bit later a more famous one, which is Shakespeare and Company, but this one is absolutely full of charm. It's another proof of the role that the Latin Quarter had in the 1920s, being the heart of the English literature, mostly American, but here you can see they are Canadian. We're going to talk a little bit more about the 1920s later during our tour, when we're going to pass in front of the very famous Shakespeare and Company bookshops. But before that, let me show you what is in my mind, at least, one of the most beautiful churches of Paris. Ladies and gentlemen, you're facing a jewel of the late Gothic style, Saint-Severin. It might have been one of the oldest churches of Paris. I mean, actually, this place is possibly where the first church ever of Paris was built, but there is nothing left. This one, however, this church was built at the very end of the medieval times. This is the reason why this is called, as a style, late Gothic. Late Gothic is pretty easy to recognize. You can see that the structure is mostly Gothic. The rules of the Gothic style are respected. You can see here on the side the very famous gargoyles. You can see as well that there are flying buttresses in order to sustain the walls from collapsing and make them strong enough to open wide window for stained glasses. And as well, you can recognize that the structure, the pointed arches, are Gothic as well. However, it's way more enthusiastic, way more decorated, way more complex, simply because at the end of the medieval times, this is the beginning of the Renaissance that came from Italy. So you have all the taste and Italian enthusiasm that starts to influence the Gothic style. So we call that late Gothic. There is one thing that most of the visitors ignore about this church, and I'm going to show it to you. It is hidden behind this truck. I hope I'm going to be able to get to it. They're blocking the view. Up. So, look at this. So, you see this lovely little square just right here? Well, it's not only a lovely little square. This used to be a graveyard. Yes. But when I say graveyards, try to forget about those peaceful and calm places we have today as graveyards, you know, those places where there's one tomb and one grave for purpose. And back in the medieval times, this would have been a common grave, okay? Nobody would have the money to have their own graves, so people were buried in common graves, and there was no shame in that. most of the cemeteries of Paris disappear today. They're not visible anymore because they were evacuated at the very end of the 1700s and the dead bodies taken to the very famous catacombs. But this one was never evacuated. So what you basically see might be one of the very last of the Parisian cemeteries. Okay, so now we gotta get inside the church. I'm gonna try to be very silent, but I really want you to see the beauty of the architecture. And I'm gonna whisper, not to bother anyone. Look at that. So you see, what is absolutely fascinating with this church is that even if you came here before the virus, during the touristic time, we are not even 5 minutes walking away from Notre Dame, and yet this church is always empty. Why? Because most of the Parisian visitors, most of the visitors of Paris, they forget to explore, all right? So never forget, guys, when you come in Paris, explore, sneak around, and when you see a door, when you see a church like this, enter in, and then you can see amazing jewel like this one. So, about the architecture, I'd like to show something very interesting. You see those two pillars on the right? So those one, they come from the original church, all right? The Gothic one, the one of maybe the 12th or 13th century, okay? So you can see those one are pure Gothic. They're strong, they're round, they're strict. They only have like this concrete interest of sustaining the walls and sustaining the vault. And then in the 1500s, because more and more people were living around, they had to make the church bigger. Oop. I'm sorry, guys. So as I told you, so those pillars are Gothic because they come from the original church. And now we're gonna get to the other side of the church. So look at that. If you look at the walls, you can still see the remaining of the former paintings, okay? So most of the churches of Paris are being renovated. The stained glasses, however, look very modern because they were remade in the 1960s. Indeed, most of the original stained glasses were destroyed during the French Revolution. And what I really wanted to show you is this pillar. Look at this. All twisted like a huge spiral, you see? And it ends up in literally a forest, a chaos of arches. This is typically late Gothic, you see? This is typically late Gothic. This is way more enthusiastic, complex, and intricate than the Gothic style. So if you're enjoying the tour so far, why don't you go ahead and click that like button and help others discover this video. And if you would like to watch more city walking tour videos like this one, then also consider subscribing to our channel and click the notification bell so that you don't miss any new videos. And if you have any place that you would like to see us offer a video tour of, then leave your suggestions in the comments section below. And lastly, if you would like to buy your tour guide a pint or a cup of coffee, links to do so are in the description below. So if you'd like to find out more about me, Romain, links to my website and social media accounts are also listed below. Now, back to the tour. Alright, we're now going outside the church and we keep strolling through the Latin Quarter, through the incredible in an absolutely astonishingly calm, very calm Latin Quarter. So here is going to be one of the best one of the best sight of the original gargoyles. Look at that, just above our heads. So remember, the gargoyles, originally, they have very practical use. You remember the word gargle comes from the noise you do with your throat when you have water in it, to gargle. The gargoyles, originally, they are water pipes, okay, that has as a goal to evacuate the water from the roof. And only after that, they are turned into monsters because they represent the presence of evil everywhere, even just outside a church. I'd just like to show one last detail. So this is one of the main saints you're going to see in Paris. His name is Saint Martin, and he's famous for having ripped, teared off his coat in two parts in order to cover an old beggar that was at the gate of the city. Okay, so this is the reason why you're going to see so many Saint Martin Street in Paris. So I really apologize to repeat that again and again, but this is one of the very first time of my life that I'm seeing this street being empty in the middle of the day. It's like totally unusual. So remember I mentioned that Haussmann, when he renovated Paris and when he built those wide, straight and large boulevards, he did it in order to control it, to make easier to control it. It's time for you to understand why. What I'm about to show you is an original medieval street. Look at, just above this gate. Look at how narrow, look at how small, look at how tight. This would have been the medieval street back in the Middle Ages. Indeed, most of the Parisians, through their windows, would have been able to shake their hands of their neighbors living in front of them. So now try to imagine the same street, but without any public lights, okay? Because you can basically consider that Paris started to have public lights at the very end of the 1700s. So without any public lights, without any sewage, okay? So people are just throwing their things through the window. And you can understand how such a street would have been dangerous and dirty. And in addition to that, you can understand that in case of riots, that would have been extremely hard for the army to fight through the streets. Paris, during all the riots of the 1900s, used to turn into a real hell for the army. Okay, the barricades being rebuilt in their back, and they would have been stoned from the roofs. Another thing that's going to help you notice if a street is very old or not, this is simply to look at the shape of it. You see, I'm going to try to go at the level of the ground. So see, you can see that this street, instead of being curved in order to have the water going on the outside of the street in the gutter, here it's the contrary. It's curved in order to have the water going in the middle. This is basically because this street comes from a time when we had no sewage. Okay, so you have to imagine that back, like not even like 3 or 4 centuries ago, I would have been stepping in the most terrible dirt. So this street here is called the Saint Jack Street. Remember, I just mentioned like those Saint Jack shells that the pilgrims used to wear on their clothes on their way to the Saint Jack of Compostelle pilgrimage. Well, this is the street they would have been taking on their way to Saint-Jacques de Compostelle. Sorry, so we got interrupted. I'm still on the Saint Jack Street, and as I told you, the pilgrimage used to start from that street. Something that made the Latin Quarter pretty famous is that the Latin Quarter in the 1920s became the heart of the Anglo-Saxon literature. It's pretty easy to understand. The USA at this moment is really not a good place to live for a very, I would say, free-speaking writer. You know, there is like the prohibition of alcohol, there is an edition crisis, and most of the books are being banished. So a lot of writers from the US, from England, from Ireland, like James Joyce, for example, came in Paris, and with them they brought jazz music, and the Latin Quarter became one of the heart of jazz music in Paris. You have right here as well as right there some of the two most famous jazz clubs of Paris. You have to imagine that if you'd have come here in the 1920s, you could have heard people like Sidney Bechet or even Louis Armstrong, and a bit later, mostly after World War II, you would have heard people like John Coltrane or Miles Davis, okay? So the Latin Quarter basically became the heart of the jazz music. And now you can see in the distance, of course, Notre Dame. But this is not about Notre Dame I'm going to speak right now. We're going to take a huge leap backward in history because we're going to talk about this one. This church might be the oldest church of Paris. It's basically the oldest church of Paris. It's very hard to tell about its origins. if you go back into the foundations, if you go like beneath the dirt, if you go beneath the surface, you would find some remainings that comes from the 3rd century, or the 4th century as well. So you imagine this is like the Romans were still around. We are pretty sure that actually the first time this building was made, it was not designed as a church, but more as a basilica. So basilica, in the Roman meaning, of course, that means not specifically a religious building, but a place of public life. Then it was turned into a church when the Roman Empire was Christianized. However, this church does not look like what it was back in the 4th century, for the simple reason that at the very beginning of the medieval times, so the 7th century, for example, only the island right here, you know, with Notre Dame on that side would have been protected with outer walls. So if you would have been studying here, for example, in the 8th century, you would not have been protected. And what happened in the 8th century and the 9th century is the attack of the Vikings. And since they could not enter the island of the city because of the outer walls, then they burnt and looted the Latin Quarter and left this church in ruins. And this is important to understand that, to then understand the architecture of that church. Indeed, you can see that the windows are designed with pointed arches, like it was the Gothic style. And yet they don't have any, it doesn't have any flying buttresses, but only contreforts, the ancestor of the flying buttresses. This mix of architecture can be explained because at the same time people were building on that side Notre Dame, the same workers would have been working on that construction site, and they would have mixed several techniques. This is the reason why this church, called Saint-Julien-de-Port, you can see the title here, Saint-Julien-de-Port, is considered as an architecture as Gothic transition. And now let's look at the last detail before we go further. Look at the things on the wall. You understand what this is. Those are simply bullet holes. Yes, this comes straight from World War II. Indeed, we're heading on the island and to Notre Dame, and you have to understand that facing Notre Dame is the police department, the Central Police Department, which was the first one in 19th of August 1944 to turn their weapons against the Germans. This is the reason why the fights were the harshest around here, and you can still find a lot of bullet impacts everywhere. And what I'm filming now is simply the oldest tree of Paris. This tree was planted here by a guy called Mr. Robin, in 4 centuries ago, 1603, 1604, according to different sources. So not only it makes it the oldest tree of Paris, but that makes it as well the oldest living organism, very simply. All right, so now we are moving to Notre Dame, and you're about to see one of the most beautiful sites of Notre Dame. Basically, those stones you see right here, those are the remainings of the Saint-Julien-de-Port original churches. And here it is. Notre Dame de Paris, the Cathedral of Paris. 2 centuries of constructions, from basically, very roughly, 1150 to 1350. This is potentially the Black Plague in 1347 that stopped the constructions. This is from this perspective, this is from this point of view that you can most clearly see all the damages of the huge fire. Okay, you can see that the fire destroyed all the roof as well as the spire of Notre Dame that fell and collapsed during the fire. And basically where all the main scaffolders are is where you would have the most beautiful stained glasses of Notre Dame that gladfully survived. So today they're not even rebuilding it. For the moment they are like stabilizing it, they're making sure that it remains stable. And we are not even specifically aware of what they plan to do about the rebuilding. So I think it was supposed to take only 5 years. Most potentially it's going to take maybe 10, 15, 20 years. Don't worry, we're going to talk a little bit more about Notre Dame. But I truly thought that before you needed to see this. Welcome, welcome to the very famous Shakespeare and Company bookshops. We are just on the other side of the street, and on the other side it's the shore of Notre Dame. Shakespeare and Company is maybe one of the most famous bookshops of Paris, I'd say. It was created by Sylvia Beach, an American woman that came in France to serve as a nurse during World War I. She opened up that bookshops in order to be the center and the heart of the English literature in Paris. This is thanks to this incredible woman that most of the James Joyce books were edited. For example, Ulysses, that have been totally banished and forbidden back in Ireland when James Joyce was original from. So you have to imagine that in this place, people like James Joyce, Hemingway, Fitzgerald would have been here chatting, editing their books, printing them books, because here not only they would find an editor and a printer, but they would find an audience. However, just know that this shop we're looking at is not the original one. The original one used to be a few blocks away, but it was closed in 1943 because Sylvia Beach refused to sell a book to an SS officer. This one was reopened in 1952 by another American, George Whiteman, that called it Shakespeare and Company in honor of Sylvia Beach. He admired. One last thing, all those windows you see up there, all these apartments, they are for rent for free. This building is meant to be a breeding ground for young writers. So the people living here, if they want to have a room here for free, they have to fulfill three main conditions. Three conditions. One, take care of your room yourself, no room service. Two, you have to work in the bookshop or maybe in the coffee shop just right here. And three, you have to read one book a day. Yes, I told you this place is meant to be a breeding ground for young writers. So if you come here, when you're gonna come here, of course, in Paris, just know that the people serving you your coffee or helping you finding the right books you want, they are here in order to become themselves writers. So, waiting for the light to turn green, we're about to cross and to go on the Notre Dame Island. This enormous building you see, this is the Central Police Department I mentioned, you know? This is where everything started, about the uprising of 1944. And there in the distance you can see a tower. This tower is the tower of Le Palais de la Cite, the City Palace. This was the original palace of the kings of France at the very beginning of the monarchy, until the middle of the 1300s, when the king finally moved to their next palace, which is the Louvre, of course, that now is a museum. So we are crossing La Seine. The bridge I'm stepping on is pretty recent, but this is the exact location of the very first bridge that was built here by the Romans when they arrived here with Julius Caesar a few years before Jesus Christ. Just so you can know, today this square in front of Notre Dame is considered as the geographical center of Paris, but during the Roman times it was not the case. During the Roman times, the real center of the city would have been this direction, at the level of the Pantheon, up the hill of the Pantheon, so 50 minutes away from here. It's only when the Roman Empire collapsed and when the Parisians needed to be hidden and needed to be most officially protected, that they decided to move their political center to here. And no, Notre Dame. As you can guess, as a passionate guy, I could speak for hours about Notre Dame, about all its meanings, all the story. I would just say that this is the absolute accomplishment of the Gothic style. You know, a Gothic building, and specifically a Gothic cathedral, is like an open book. Everything you see has a sense. None of the decorations, none of the shapes, none of the symbols you see are here randomly. Let me give you just two examples before we move forward. For example, those two towers. I don't know if you can clearly see it on your screen, but they're not exactly the same size. The reason is very simple. If those two towers would have been the same size, then that would have been meaning that human is capable of perfect creation. And this would have been a blasphemy. Those two towers are not exactly the same size in order to recall that it remains human and not to bother God. Isn't that amazing, honestly? Okay, I give you an extra one. You see there is like this main rows, the front rows, like made of stained glasses. When it was built originally, it was the hugest rows of stained glasses ever built in the world, 9 meters large. So I don't know if you see that, but this rose is, I guess you agree, has a shape, a cycle. But with those two columns on each side, you have a cycle inside a square. Here again, it has a sense, because the cycle is an infinite shape, has the same spirit when the square is limited as the human flesh. If you put a cycle inside a square, then you have the same spirit going down in the flesh. This is the reason why the statue in the middle is Mary holding in her hands Jesus, the Holy Spirit in the flesh. One thing before we move forward, just know that most of the statues you see, they are copies from the original ones, copies from the big renovation of the cathedral in the middle of the 1800s. Indeed, Notre Dame was the main target of the French Revolution destructions because it represented both the church power they hated and the king power they hated even more, because this is here that most of the time the king would celebrate his main event, his main celebration. Up. So we are moving, and now I'm gonna cut it off a little bit because there is no much to see, and let's see each other in basically 5 minutes on the other side of the island. Hi everyone, I'm back. So you can see I just crossed the island. This is the Central Police Department, and you can see here the other side, the other end of the city palace. Remember the original palace of the kings, where the monarchy used to be until the middle of the 14th century. There's much to see about this. There are much to say about this palace, but first let's go to the other side. There's a lot of things to see around here. I hope the wind doesn't keep you from listening to me. So this huge building you see, first of all, it's the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, okay? This is the city hall for all Paris. Even if remember that Paris is divided in 20 districts and there is one city hall per district. But this one is the main city hall for the whole city. If you come to Paris, you have to visit all the district which is like behind the Hôtel de Ville. It's called Le Marais, literally the swamp. But don't worry, it's far from being a swamp. You can consider it today as the hipster capital of Paris, when you're gonna find all the little cute shops and all the trend events, like for example the fashion day, the fashion celebration, fashion festival. And as well, the Marais is very famous for being the Jewish quarter. This here is called Le Marché aux Fleurs, the flower markets. But let me tell you a funny story. Originally here, it was not the flower market, but the chicken market. In French, literally, poulet. And because the police department was next to the chicken market, well, the police used to be called the chickens. And what's funny is that today everybody basically called the policemen chicken. We all call them poulet, even if most of the Parisians totally ignore where it comes from. This enormous building here we've been working along is the Hôtel Dieu. It's a huge hospital that was built in the 1900s, even if the Hôtel Dieu, the original Hôtel Dieu, was created at the beginning of the medieval times, making it one of the oldest hospitals of Paris, if not of France. So now we're about to cross the street. And here we go. So, on the side here you can see two enormous buildings. There are two very famous theaters, and in the middle you can see a square. This square is called the Châtelet Square, considering as the central hub of all the transportation network in Paris. Basically, all subs pass through Châtelet. More interesting is that Châtelet in French means a small castle, because indeed here used to stand a small castle, keeping the access on the river, as basically a souvenir of the Vikings' attacks. And this is Napoleon that destroyed this little castle that was turned into a prison. Before that, it was turned into a prison and Napoleon destroyed it. This is in this prison that happened one of the darkest events of the French Revolution, the September Massacre. After August 1792, when Louis XVI was definitely arrested and France was turned into a republic, the Parisians turned into a terrible paranoid state. They were afraid that all the nobles, all the nobles of France turned into spies. So what they decided to do is simply to go into the prison and to make their own justice. During the September Massacre, this is like thousands and thousands of people that got massacred. You can consider it as the beginning of what we call the terror, which is the entrance, the start of violence into the French Revolution. Talking about the French Revolution, we're getting closer and closer to the city palace, le Palais de la Cité. But this is not its true name today. Today, people would rather call it la Conciergerie. So, la Conciergerie, pardon monsieur, the Conciergerie, after the king left it to move into the Louvre, remember that? It was the King Charles V in the middle of the 1400s. The Palais de la Cité, the Conciergerie, was then turned into an enormous jail. And this jail took a very huge importance during the French Revolution. Indeed, this is here that most of the most famous prisoners of the French Revolution used to stay. For example, Marie Antoinette. So you have to imagine that Marie Antoinette remained here from the moment she got arrested on the 10th of August 1782 until she was finally executed at the Concorde Square, so at the basically this direction, like 30 minutes walking this direction. It's in the end of the year 1794. This absolutely gorgeous watch, this dial, was originally built by Charles V, but the version you see today, covered with gold, is a version from Louis XIV. It was the first public, It was the first public dial of the city. And this is a strong symbol, because you have to understand that for a Parisian, the only way to know what time it is, it's to hear the bells, from the steeples. The church used to be the master of time, but with a dial like this built by the king, this is not the king being the master of time. We keep moving through to the west, okay? So if I would walk like this for 2 or 3 days, I would end up my way in Normandy. And so we're heading to the west, and I really would like you to see those two strange towers. Those two towers are medieval, but their name is pretty interesting. We call that les tours bon bec. If I translate it literally, that would mean the good mouth. Do you know why? Well, simply because this was the part of the jail where people were tortured. Okay, so this good mouth would indeed come from the fact that you would hear the scream of the people being tortured here. Of course, today nobody's tortured anymore. This building, until pretty recently, until maybe 2 or 3 years, this building was the Central Palace of Justice, the Central Palace of Justice of Paris. It was recently moved to the outside of Paris, in the northwest of Paris. This beautiful bridge you see there, it's the oldest bridge of Paris. It's called le Pont Neuf, which is a pretty paradox, because Pont Neuf literally means the new bridge. But this is the oldest one. It was started by the King Henry V and then was over by the King Henry IV. It doesn't really look like what it was back in the time, because never forget that until roughly Louis XIV, there was houses on bridges. People used to live on the bridges because there is always a problem of overpopulation and room for accommodations in Paris. So people used to live in bridges, to have their houses on bridges, which was extremely dangerous. It was extremely dangerous, and living on the bridges was mostly dedicated to people that were marginalized. For example, the bridge there is called le Pont au Change, literally the exchange bridge. Why? Because this is where most of the Jews, the only people allowed to do some banking activity, used to have their houses. Nobody wanted to live on the bridges, so people left this kind of houses to the Jews. So this bridge is still called le Pont au Change, but you can see, according to the huge N on it, it was built by Napoleon. So we keep moving a little bit forward, and we're gonna end up our tour right there on the bridge. Let's find each other in 3 minutes on the bridge for our conclusion. Hi everyone, I'm back. We've been through a little bit of rain, so I had to take shelter. But no, look at this amazing view. So as you can see, I am standing on the bridge. You can see in the distance the palace of the city and the city hall. But no, look at this gorgeous view. The light is absolutely perfect. Basically, all the main highlights of Paris are in front of your eyes. Maybe we should start with, oh, look at the lucky guys. This is how the rich Parisians have fun, just riding on their boat, even if it's forbidden with the lockdown. Who cares? So on that side you can see this enormous mass of buildings. Well, it's very simply the Louvre. Everything from that to that is the Louvre, an enormous museum, the biggest in the world, with the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Originally, the Louvre is not a museum at all. It's not even a palace. It's a stronghold, keeping the access from the west to any boat coming, like the Vikings. Then it was turned into a palace when the king moved from the island of the city. And when Louis XIV moved to Versailles, it was basically abandoned. And then the revolutionaries turned it into a museum. And today it is one of the nicest museums ever. Then you can see, of course, in the distance, the Eiffel Tower that was built in 1889 for the World Exhibition, for the World Fair. Something I'd like to show you as well is this building just right here. This is the Orsay Museum, where you're going to find all the art of the 1900s. The Orsay Museum was built at the same time as the Eiffel Tower for the same reason, the World Fair, but it was not built as a museum. Originally, Orsay was a train station to make possible for the visitors of the World Fair to arrive directly in the heart of the exhibition. It was only turned into a museum quite lately, in the 1970s. The last time it was used as a train station was during the World War II, at the end of the World War II, when the survivors of other death camps came back to Paris. You can see as well this lovely dome. This is built, this is called the French Institute, l'Académie Française. Originally it was built for the Prime Minister of Louis XIV, for Mazarini, but this is now turned into the Académie Française. This is basically where the immortals, this is how they're called, so a bunch of guys that are named for life, decide what the French language shall be. So this is within this building, within those walls, that the French dictionary is written. And last but not least, this island. It used to be called the Jews' Island, but if there is a good reason to remember this island, is because this is here in 1307 and then 1314 that the Templars Knights, the Order of the Temple, creating during the Crusade, got all burnt alive. Indeed, this order, this military religious order, became too powerful and too rich to the eyes of the French king, nicknamed the Iron King, and he finally decided to burn them all after accusing them of false crimes. So you see, in basically one view, one site, you have all the main highlights of Paris. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, so this is the end of our little tour. You can see that in barely 1 hour, we've been through all the main highlights of the center of Paris. I truly wish that I made you want to come to Paris as soon as possible. I wish you an excellent day. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.